All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today, and I keep trying not to say that my guest is Peter Thiel because it's not. It's Max Chafkin, who's written a book about Peter Thiel. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for doing this. So, Max writes about tech, and boy, has he written about tech. He's written a whole book called The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. By the way, when did that become a thing? After the title, like a sentence or two. I feel like you can't have a book anymore that's just like the rise and fall of Western civilization.
I don't know. I mean, I wonder if it's, that's the first time that's occurred to me. I wonder if it has to do with, online bookstores and SEO and that sort of thing. I mean, of course, nowadays, it's all about the, these basically these big tech platforms, as you know, and
Yep.
and I'm sure like I don't know if Amazon plays a role or what's going on.
You know what? I think that's the answer. I think 100% that's probably the answer.
Yeah, I would think. And yeah, it's like you gotta describe it up front. But it's a good. I'm happy with the title.
Yeah, and it has been said that this book will change the way that you look at Silicon Valley history, which is pretty exciting. How did you become like a scribe? How did you get into the reporting business? And when are you starting your venture capital firm?
Yeah, that seems like the career path, huh? I am like adamantly opposed to, and this is being recorded, which is good but adamantly opposed to all these journalists starting venture capital firms. Although I guess more power to you if you've got to. But
well, and Mike Moritz, I think, screwed everybody up.
You're right. That's true. I was just interested in writing, I guess, and after I graduated college, I had done some work for college newspapers and stuff like that. After I graduated college, I spent a year working in France at a school teaching English, and I was really bored and I had no friends, and so I was like reading a lot, basically reading the news constantly. This is back in 2004, 2004, 2005. Iraq war is going on. There's a lot of it was an interesting time to be following the news. And I just got really into it. And I, started applying for internships and got a job at a business magazine. And I think probably partly just because I was like really young, they let me cover tech, which was really fortuitous because, obviously, I think it's the most interesting industry on the planet, and it's become more culturally important over those past 15 16 years.
And did you ever imagine that it's like that? I mean, writing about tech should be kind of like a boring part of the business section job, but it's become like Shakespearean. I mean, you've got the WeWork guy, there's the Theranos story, there's Jewel, it's amazing.
Well, that part I think is shocking and amazing, like the way that these tech folks have become larger than life figures. And Thiel, there's a version of that with Thiel where I remember, and one of the things that got me interested in the book was, he had been around the tech industry and really involved in all these important companies for a long time. And, it's like, obviously, you're like, Peter Thiel's got some money in there. You're like, okay. And I had talked to him a handful of times for various stories. And then in 2016, same month, he endorsed Donald Trump for president, or it was announced that he would be a delegate at the Republican National Convention, which was kind of surprising because, of course, Silicon Valley seemed, at the time pretty hostile to Trump and Trumpism. And same time, he was unmasked and then kind of, gladly unmasked himself as the force behind the Gawker litigations, the person who destroyed Gawker. So suddenly, it's kind of like he was embracing this, this new persona, this another one of these larger than life personas, except instead of, maybe Adam Newman, it's this kind of goofy, like spending a lot of money, big thinker. Thiel kind of went for the supervillain thing, I mean, and I think just in some ways, like almost self-consciously, kind of embraced having this profile and using that profile, to his advantage.
Yeah. Well, how does he first come on? So for people who don't know who Peter Thiel is, he kind of comes onto the scene, I guess, with PayPal. Is that where we sort of first would hear about him publicly?
Yeah, well, if you had been following conservative politics, you actually might have heard his name before PayPal, because
Really?
he wrote a uh, so shortly after Stanford, he went to Stanford undergrad, Stanford Law School, and he wrote a book, a kind of a sort of memoir slash screed with David Sachs, who's another,
Yeah.
well-known venture capitalist, member of the PayPal mafia, called The Diversity Myth. And it was these two young Stanford guys basically complaining that Stanford was too left wing, that Stanford was catering to the needs of minority students and women, and I guess like non-Western curricula, more than it should have, and that fit really well into there's kind of like a I don't know if proud is the right word, but a proud tradition in conservative activist circles of this kind of, campus rabble rousing. Dinesh D'Souza had published a book not too long before that, and they were in that kind of zone. They were basically, 20 something, earlier. Thiel might have been just turned 30 when he put the money into PayPal, but basically like young conservative rabble rousers.
Right.
And he at the same time was kind of reinventing himself as a venture capitalist, and connects with this guy Max Levchin, brilliant coder, who had the original, PayPal started as a Palm Pilot encryption thing. So that was Levchin's idea. They team up, they start PayPal. There are a million payments companies at the time, late 90s. PayPal, thanks to a combination of skill, luck, whatever, brilliance on the part of this team, which was very cohesive, because many of them had come from this kind of conservative media world that Thiel came from, managed to sell themselves to eBay for a nice exit. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of like $1.5 billion, which, not a huge amount of money considering PayPal's worth, in the hundreds of millions of dollars today. But of course, at the time, wreckage of the dot-com bubble, that was a big deal. And he used that really as a jumping off point to sort of refashion himself as an investor, and became, one of the most prolific and successful venture capitalists, right, Silicon Valley's ever seen.
And what do you make of that PayPal group? We have this mafia. I don't know why it's mafia in Silicon Valley, but it's a bunch of people worked at one company and then go on to success. And PayPal had a weird, Max Levchin certainly now runs a firm. Reid Hoffman, you probably heard of him, like David Sachs, like they seem to be the one company where something, what the heck do you make of that?
Well, I think some of it is, I agree. It's really interesting. And I think even in the sort of tech world, even in the insiders, I think they underestimate just how influential kind of like the PayPal mafia has been. And I don't just mean in terms of sort of moving money around and like, promoting companies. I mean, in terms of like cultural and ideological influence, and kind of influencing the way that the tech industry operates today. And I think some of it has to do with the fact that they were, trying to do that there was an effort to work together, and this kind of like, banding together, supporting each other. I think it was to some extent self-conscious. I think there are other groups, right, that if I think the PayPal mafia thing was popularized, in the mid 2000s when Fortune magazine does this cover. They were already calling themselves and being called the PayPal Mafia.
A picture, right?
But there's a picture of it, and they're dressed up. Peter is dressed up like Don Corleone, right. And I'm trying to think. I think Levchin is Tom Hayden, right. The Robert Duvall character. And they're all wearing, and there's some of the lesser mafia members who are also incredibly successful. Jeremy Stoppelman, founder of Yelp, he's in there, he's in the back in a tracksuit. Right. Reid Hoffman's got a big gold chain. I think there are other groups, obviously, that would have said no to that, and would have said, like, we're not a mafia. We're not working together. And Elon actually is not in that shoot. Like I don't know if it was, because he had a conflict or whatever, but they shot him separately. He didn't show up for the Godfather pose. Right. But I think it was self-conscious. And I think, and when you talk to early PayPal people, they talk about this a lot. The fact that a lot of these guys were sort of bad boy libertarians gave them a kind of that gave them cohesion, and that cohesion is a kind of power. I mean, people, I think there's a kind of conventional wisdom that says, you want a team of rivals, and of course that is good, but having a whole bunch of people who are very loyal to one another and are pointed in the same direction, that created, that created power for them. And I think it's part of what led to their success. And then also, obviously a bunch of brilliant guys who were thinking differently and, very good at spotting, new companies.
Right. And everyone should look up that picture because it is funny. Like the guys in the background are guys like, that's the guy who founded Yelp, and he's like the least successful guy in this picture. As you did this book about Peter Thiel, you could have covered any of those other guys. Could have, what about him? Just said, okay, because writing a book seems hard to me.
Well, I think partly it's what I said earlier about the kind of turn in 2016 to this kind of larger than life figure. Right. And I obviously, when you're writing a book, characters, I'm really into writing about people, and especially people who are complicated, and a gay immigrant technologist who endorses Donald Trump, who is basically, from a party has tended to be hostile to, LGBT, rights and stuff, to who is, adamantly anti-immigrant, who is kind of wears his Ludditism, if that's a word, on his sleeve, kind of uses it almost as a credential. Like that, the psychology there is very interesting. Like, why would you do that? That is interesting and different. And then the other thing is, I think that Thiel's engagement with Washington, Thiel's effort to be influential in DC, to kind of control the narrative, that is something that the entire tech industry, he's kind of leading the tech industry in that direction.
Right.
And so it felt like a way where you could talk about a person, but you could also talk about an industry and this tendency, this kind of the way this disruptive tendency is being applied beyond tech and to things like government.
Well, how does he? Is he emerges from PayPal? He's made money, of course, from PayPal for their 1.6 whatever it is billion-dollar exit, but he's not a billionaire yet.
Oh, he's definitely a billionaire.
No, at the time.
Sorry, PayPal time. My bad.
Okay, he then gets engaged with Facebook, right? Isn't that his big
That's the next thing. Yeah.
Really, what he did, and it's the craziest thing. He turned a small amount of money into the biggest amount of money in history, tax-free.
Right. Well, I think some of that has to do with that kind of PayPal mafia network. I think it came to him, through a handful of things, but I think Reid Hoffman is among the brokers there. And, but you can sort of see why Facebook might appeal to somebody like Peter Thiel, because PayPal was like a network business. That's kind of what allowed it to grow. It used this very aggressive growth strategy, which I think has been copied and aped and super influential, where they were paying people to basically create accounts, pouring huge amounts of money into growth, basically grow at all costs. I think, Reid Hoffman calls this blitzscaling now. And it's, it's like de rigueur.
Right.
And that obviously fits with Mark Zuckerberg. And I also think, who has this, who's kind of super focused on growth, was also really trying to grow fast. And, Zuckerberg was kind of like a bad boy in his own, obviously in his own way. He wasn't a politically engaged figure, although I think he and Thiel do have some political alignment, but he had, pissed off the administrators at Harvard, just like Peter Thiel had pissed off the administrators at Stanford. And so I think there was definitely some common ground there. One thing that's interesting. It was Facebook. Well, it wasn't just Facebook, because around the same time he started a hedge fund, and the hedge fund was incredibly successful. If you grab somebody, like random Wall Street Journal reader or like a Davos attendee in 2008 and said, who is Peter Thiel? They would say he's one of the world's most successful hedge fund managers, because he had this, he had billions of dollars under management. He was not really a tech guy at all. The tech thing was kind of a sideshow. And so, he was able to make a bunch of money there, and kind of this really smart approach where he was investing in tech companies, but also making these macro investments. And, he's able to grow his wealth very quickly. And as you say, he pioneered a very interesting and controversial tax strategy, where he was basically putting these shares of in startups in a Roth IRA. And a Roth IRA is was created to be used by basically like middle-class workers. There's a very low cap of how much you can put in there. Definitely was not intended to have enormous sums of money. And very cleverly, Thiel and a few other PayPal connected people have done this. And I think it's obviously the tactic has caught on. Was able to shield a lot of this money for tax purposes. Which, when you think about, like, that's kind of in character for a hedge fund manager, whereas maybe it's less so for a Silicon Valley investor. The stereotype in the Valley, of course, is we don't care about, money is, who cares about money? It's all about impact. But
but everybody moves to Texas or Florida, right before their IPO at this point. Yeah,
that's the trend.
There is a funny thing that I've noticed about, because I'm an investor, venture capitalist, but I noticed about people who got really rich in these companies as investors. Is part of what happened is there weren't, now there's a lot of people who've made a ton of money in Silicon Valley and they angel invest. But back then there are only a few. You either worked at eBay or PayPal or Yahoo. You worked at one of a few companies that gave you the kind of money where you could put, it's ridiculous to put $100,000 into something.
Right.
And so to some extent there's just this really small group of people that even had the money to invest. And that's why maybe Reid Hoffman was in Facebook and Peter Thiel was in Facebook and a bunch of people
makes sense.
In all these companies at the time.
Yeah. And I mean, it was a much smaller, the whole world was much smaller. The money was smaller. And as you say, the universe of VCs was smaller. That's right. Kind of, these people who got in the ground floor. It really is. It's amazing. And like the way, what you brought up about, these larger than life characters, that's, I guess it's a symptom of like the growth of the industry and just the way that it's matured.
Yeah. Well, and I think the outcomes change too. I remember, venture capitalists investing in things like Facebook and saying, well, this thing could be worth $1 billion someday. It's like, well, it wasn't worth $1 billion. It was worth 500 billion. Like the magnitude just shifted in such a big way.
Yeah. And little known fact, Zuckerberg, of course, said no to a $1 billion acquisition offer from Yahoo.
Yeah.
But his venture capitalists, they all wanted him to sell. Including Peter Thiel. They weren't, they did not have the vision to see that this thing was going to be worth, $1 trillion, whatever it's worth now, at 1.5 trillion. I don't know. I haven't checked the market cap lately, but it would be worth like this absurd amount of money that, they said, man, this is great money. This is life-changing money for Mark Zuckerberg. And, frankly, at the time, right, a lot of these VCs had not done that well over the past, 6-7 years. So, it was like turning down that money was crazy. And that's one reason I think why Zuckerberg gets the respect, because VCs were all telling him to sell for sure.
Yeah. It's like people get rich on Bitcoin. You had to be crazy enough to like not sell your Bitcoin at $600 and then not sell it at $10,000 and then not sell when you were worth $700,000, you had to hold on to that to be to seven, and so Zuckerberg kind of had his version of that.
Yeah. And this is one thing about Thiel. He has been really successful at kind of creating this, a brand for himself, like a personal brand, as a big thinker and as a risk taker. He wrote a best-selling book, 0 to 1.
Right.
But actually, when you look at what he actually does as an investor, he's more cautious than you would imagine. Yeah. He sells. As I said, he tried to get Zuckerberg, along with the rest of the investors, try to get Zuckerberg to consider Yahoo's offer, and then sold his Facebook stock, almost immediately after the IPO. Most of his Facebook stock, almost immediately after the IPO, and he's doing the same with Palantir right now. He's been selling Palantir stock like crazy, even as Palantir is, at least from a stock market perspective, is just on fire. He's somebody who sells when he's up, and I think that's, I do think. That's one of these cases where sort of probably acting more like a conventional investor rather than like sort of believing the Silicon Valley hype or whatever probably, works to his advantage.
So what does he do as he becomes like really well? And I always ask people this and I never get a satisfying answer. Does he do anything as he becomes really wealthy? Like buy a yacht, fund a football, like something, like does something change in it or?
He's done all sorts of crazy stuff, but it's definitely in this kind of realm of kind kind of intellectual, quirky intellectual / borderline, intellectually, radical things. Like, he's done a lot, obviously, to promote kind of, what I think you'd call like extreme political causes. The sort of most famous thing was the seasteading. Basically, when you're talking about this inflection point when he made a bunch of money and started, doing stuff.
Right.
He did buy like a Ferrari, actually, and he bought
Right.
He bought a really nice house. He's got a lot of really nice houses. But not they're all very, tasteful, as I understand. They're not
Right.
like he's not like adventurous with his interior
Right.
design. But he is adventurous, finding this, crazy idea that we're gonna like create these offshore communities called seasteads, and that's going to be a way that we can, evade taxes and
Right.
experiment with, off-label drugs, and do all the things that government regulations, won't let us do. And
Right.
like that is a, there's like. There's a version where you just like read an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, which is
Right.
also something Thiel
Right.
would do. But then he also, on top of that, starts pushing this kind of extreme libertarian movement. And I think, you can see the Thiel Fellowship, which was, this thing that probably most people listening are familiar with, but basically $100,000 to people. It started out under the age of 20. I think it's up to the age 22 now. But effectively paying people $100,000 to drop out of college.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a, anti-establishment
Right.
bit of activism. And then I think, we should think about his support of Donald Trump and
Right.
kind of, he's got, he was sort of, basically exploring and trying to help in various ways, people connected to the alt-right. And I think that stuff is in that kind of tradition of kind of like using his money to push like a really out there, political cause, at least out there from like a mainstream perspective.
And do you think, I mean, is he, in some sense, there's this idea that he goes to war with Silicon Valley. He destroys the publication Gawker, basically, which is crazy. Like backs Donald Trump, which, is not, most people in Silicon Valley don't appear to back Donald Trump, although who knows. And then at some point has a fit and leaves Silicon Valley for LA, which isn't really the most, most conservative spot in the world. It's not like he went to Omaha or something. He went to LA. Right. But very publicly announces he's leaving San Francisco. Like, what is he doing in all this? Is it really he's following his libertarian star, or is he actually enjoying playing with Silicon Valley?
I think it's probably both. I mean, I think some of this is in the tradition of being provocative. I mean, the word that always comes into my head is troll, which of course, I don't like when Thiel started the Stanford Review, like that word was not in the, in the lingo, right. But this idea of being, deliberately provocative. And I think that's part of his thing. And he uses that to, to get attention, to create influence, and to attract followers. I mean, he has a, he is out there politically, but he also has like a really loyal and devoted base of, fans, friends, admirers, etc., who create value for him. And I think, there is this interesting thing, though, where you bring up kind of taking on tech, because Thiel, of course, is on the board of Facebook. I mean, it is really, brain-breakingly weird that that Thiel. So he's backing two political candidates in the Senate right now, J.D. Vance and Blake Masters, and both of them are just like, acting like they're going to, lock Mark Zuckerberg in irons,
right.
and it's like there's like a level of dissonance going on where it's like you do know that like the guy who's paying for all these these ads that you're running works at Facebook, and it's hard to know what's going on there. Like, it's hard to know if maybe Thiel is conflicted about it. Maybe he feels genuinely loyal to Mark Zuckerberg and feels like,
Right.
yeah, actually Facebook has gone too far. I think it's like, it's a totally reasonable position. Like those guys are out there and kind of crazy on a bunch of issues. But I think there are a lot of people who think that, tech companies are out of control or whatever. And so I think it's possible there's like he's like honestly conflicted about it. I also think that, he's somebody who's very interested in politics and ideology. And I think his advocacy and his, sort of pushing Facebook in all sorts of ways, which have happened both kind of in public and in private, on these kind of issues of like being nice to conservatives, like that has pushed Facebook to the right. And it's had like an impact on the way Facebook creates policy and how Facebook, for instance, like why did Facebook not fact check Donald Trump in 2019 when the Trump campaign was lying about, Nancy Pelosi? And it's partly because there had been this campaign going on that, would have made it very, very, very difficult for Zuckerberg to do that. And Thiel was doing that. So he was kind of creating a situation where I think Mark Zuckerberg was under some pressure to, as Thiel sees it, right, be balanced as maybe an outsider perspective might see it, cater to the needs of a sitting president with whom Thiel's close. I also think that Zuckerberg really needs Thiel, and Zuckerberg probably, I imagine, I don't know, because he didn't talk to me for this book. But like, I don't know what Zuckerberg thinks about this, but I just sort of imagine him like, opening the Wall Street Journal and just like seeing JD Vance said this and his, noting and just, smacking himself in the face and going, oh God, not again, not again. But I think that really Facebook, it needs to have some credibility with the right, and Thiel gives him that credibility. He's not just, he's not some, half-hearted conservative. He's somebody who's friends with Steve Bannon, who was, he's not like a never Trumper or one of these like rhinos. He's a real Republican of the current Republican Party, and he's on our board. And I think that gives Mark Zuckerberg a little bit of comfort. And so it's like a kind of it's a mutually beneficial relationship, even though they seem to be completely opposed to one another in public and possibly, in private.
Yeah. Well, and so that absolutely makes sense. I hadn't thought of that. And I think kind of maybe the last puzzle, there's a million other pieces in the book, but Palantir emerges, which is kind of a weird, I actually happen to know what a Palantir is because I read Lord of the Rings. It's kind of like
seeing stone.
Yeah. It's like a seeing stone that lets you see around Middle Earth. But this company is a little bit weird for Silicon Valley. It's not super weird, but it's like a kind of a government support, not government supported, but a government contractor sort of, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It is government supported. It was originally funded by the CIA.
Right, okay.
In addition to Peter Thiel. It grew, it was started, and this is another case of kind of maybe Thiel, applying a playbook that is really comes from outside of Silicon Valley onto Silicon Valley, and in doing so, pushing Silicon Valley into a different direction. But, post 9/11, the US government obviously was very worried about, data mining, and this idea that we actually had the intelligence to catch bin Laden and like the hijackers, but we failed. And we failed because we weren't looking, putting the pieces together. And Thiel, very savvily saw that and kind of figured out a way to take some of the technology. It's not even really technology, but sort of the approach that Max Levchin had developed at PayPal to stop money laundering and apply it to, data mining for terrorists. And that was the pitch. And honestly, I don't think, this is a controversial thing to say, but like, I don't think Palantir really worked for many years. And, I did a lot of reporting on this. Like, this is based not just on my opinion, but on, numerous conversations with early employees and some current employees. And, it really, was really just a sales pitch for a very long time. And, but over the years or whatever, they were able to, build up this software product and they really started to take off. I mean, a little bit in the years prior to 2016, but 2016, starting around the time that Trump is elected, their revenue started to really go up because they won some huge, they won a huge Army contract, right. And so it is out of character and it's totally different. And I think there is, a good debate to be had about whether what we should think about Palantir, because, I think most people don't argue with the idea that, whatever the government should be, looking at intelligence and looking at intelligence in a smart way. But of course, when you're data mining, you can very quickly, violate people's privacy. I mean, you can, as we know from, whatever the last 5-6 years of following the news, like if I have your Facebook data, I know a lot about you. I know if you're pregnant, I know what disease you have, I know your sexual orientation, I know everything there is to know. And so of course there's a lot of, I think there's some serious questions to be asked. And I also think, there's something a bit inconsistent of a libertarian and a group of people who purport to be libertarian, starting a company that is, basically a surveillance company. Yeah. So those are for me, kind of difficult questions. And then the other thing I'll say though is, as much as Palantir is kind of out of character for what we think of as Silicon Valley, I mean, the Valley started as a military industrial complex, factory. So in some ways it's kind of just going back to the good old days of, if that's your point of view, of, building technology for the Defense Department.
Yeah. I've had a lot of people on, Brad Feld, or, people who think back on the history of Silicon Valley, and they're like, writ large, it's basically a bunch of defense contractors, technology, and a bunch of hippies dropping acid with the creative visions that might give you, or some version of that. And that alchemy happened here, and that alchemy didn't happen in New York or Chicago or Denver. It just happened to happen here. It's a very weird alchemy, but it created the, DARPA starting the internet, basically.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, like it all started with the atom bomb, really. I mean, and so, I think it is just a really crazy history. I'm reading a really good book on this, The Code by Margaret O'Mara, but where she talks about this kind of, that duality, the duality of kind of, freedom loving, or whatever you want to call it. And basically, the starch shirt, the guys with the short sleeve white shirts, and the funny glasses, or whatever.
The guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, to wrap up a bit, we come to today, and now Peter Thiel's in the mix on Bitcoin. Does that surprise you that he's isn't his point of view now that it's I don't want to get this wrong, it's a weapon, China's using against us? Like,
very, very hard to know what he's up to with that comment. He called it a potential, weapon of the Chinese government. Well, so a couple of things. One is, I think one thing people don't appreciate. So PayPal, just take it all the way back to PayPal for a second. That company, of course, there were a lot of payments companies back then. The idea of, buying stuff on the internet, that wasn't like a particularly novel idea that Max Levchin and Peter Thiel came up with. But what was kind of novel is the way they talked about it. They talked about it as as once we have, money that we can move through PayPal accounts, you're going to be able to have, in effect, your own private Swiss bank account. You'll be able to evade currency controls. Repressive governments won't be able to do anything about it. And it's exactly the way the crypto heads talk. And it is the ideology of Bitcoin. And so I think in that sense, he's very much aligned with the crypto movement. He's invested in lots of crypto companies. And as a figure in that world, I think he's owned Bitcoin at various times. I don't know if he owns it today, but it would not, definitely would not surprise me if he did. My guess with that comment is that he is trying to push the US government to regulate the cryptocurrency in the way that he would like to be regulated. So, there's right now, there are crackdowns going on all over the world around crypto. It's unclear if it'll even be legal in China. It's unclear if it'll be regulated as a security, or how it'll be regulated in the US. And of course, those decisions, are going to move, the not just the market for the coins, but it'll change, what happens with these companies. And I think there's an argument that you've seen Zuckerberg make this argument when he testified about Libra, and I think he's also used it in the context of Facebook, where it's this idea that, like, hey, China's got TikTok, we need to have our own, they're like letting TikTok do whatever the hell they want. They're not stopping TikTok from data mining. And we better be careful, because if you regulate Facebook too much, what's going to happen is you're going to have Chinese Facebook, and you're not going to like Chinese Facebook because it's going to be controlled by a repressive government. And I think you're sort of seeing the same thing with the crypto conversation, where the idea is, US government, you got to work with us, because if you don't, you're going to have a digital yuan, and that digital yuan is going to be, that's going to be the money that moves the world, and it's going to be controlled by some people who you don't like. And so it's an argument, and it's also, I think, a bit of a threat. And it's this savvy argument that we're seeing a lot of tech people make, and it's one that I don't know how to evaluate it. I mean, when Zuckerberg says that, I mean, he does have a point, but I'm not sure that means that we just let Facebook go, run ragged over our personal information. So I don't know. I mean, I do think it's important probably to think about these technologies in the context of China, in the context of global power. And I think that's what's behind that.
Well, as your book, The Contrarian, kind of comes out into the world, what do you've sat with Peter Thiel in Silicon Valley for a while to create the book. What's your kind of takeaway about the future, or what are you thinking now that this has kind of brought you to?
I mean, I am really interested. I mean, I'm interested in a couple of things. I mean, one is this kind of continued conversation, which, hopefully the book is in this stream, but, talking about tech responsibility. I mean, I think that, and there are other people, Ellen Pao, there's a whole group of Roger McNamee of kind of combination of, there were some whistleblowers and activists who are sort of calling attention to the fact that the tech industry has grown a lot in power over the last 20 years, that it was for a time an insurgent business, and now has grown into the most culturally and economically and politically, I would argue, significant industry on the planet. And maybe we need to think about how we regulate the industry, and how we even talk about it, how we think about it differently, in the context of that. Maybe these companies have a little bit more responsibility to society now that they're worth trillions of dollars. And I do think that that's a conversation that I hope the book speaks to and helps shed light on. I mean, I'm also just continue to be interested in technology for its own sake, for the geeky parts of technology. And it's hard to know, given that power dynamic, obviously that squeezes things out, that it makes it harder to, as I'm sure you know better than me, as a venture capitalist, but obviously it makes it harder to find opportunities when Facebook, it just owns everything, or Google and Apple, and when there's so much control. But, the thing is, I was just revisiting, the Master Switch by Tim Wu, where he argues that communications technologies go through this cycle. They basically turn into monopolies, and the government, knocks them down, and then that creates opportunities for the next monopoly.
Right.
We're seeing that now. I mean, maybe some of this regulation that's coming is gonna create new opportunities. I do think, just crypto itself is a really interesting, those global power dynamics and Peter Thiel's, motivation or whatever aside, I just think the technology is interesting, the way it's kind of really moving into money and finance. I mean, that is just super exciting and weird. It's so weird that we don't really yet know how to talk about it. And I think I'm not big into finance, but I do think that is interesting. And I'm, just excited to read and learn more, and kind of, whatever, talk to some of these, entrepreneurs and things like that. So that's all good. And also, I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone, but, I'm pretty jazzed about, mRNA and the potential, as somebody who's followed the tech industry, the way, the development of these vaccines as quickly as they were developed, it's an amazing achievement. We were witnessing this amazing history, and it's easy to lose, obviously there's anti-vaxxers. It's easy to lose sight of, the bad of what's good. But I mean, man, it's just really exciting how quickly we were able to deal with this pandemic. And I think there are going to be amazing stories, technology stories that will come out of the COVID.
That's really interesting, because I've joked or whatever, noted for a while, if you look where Silicon Valley has come from, a modem to where we are today, and then you look at like medicine, you're like, well, like ALS, 30 years ago, we did about, we've gone nowhere.
Right.
And so if we're actually going, if that kind of advance that's happened in, social networks and these kinds of things happens in medicine, like, holy cow.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Like, everybody talks about how, you've probably read some of this stuff, but the actual mRNA vaccine was, designed or something like, a day or whatever.
It was done like the first weekend or something.
Yeah. And then it took them a year. And there are a lot of people who are like mad about that. Like, it's the clinical trial trials should have been even quicker. So maybe, yeah, sure. But like when the pandemic started, I mean, the fastest, we hadn't developed a vaccine in a year. Like the timelines that people were talking about were crazy long, and they managed to like show that you can get this stuff onto the market quickly. And now reading about, I work at Business Week, and I've been involved as an editor with some of these, writing about, Moderna and Pfizer, and what they're talking about, we're building these kind of universal coronavirus vaccines, or a vaccine that is gonna inoculate you against not just the flu but a bunch of these other pandemics. I mean, that is really it's really thrilling, and the potential to use mRNA to treat other things like cancers and stuff like that is also just, it's really cool. And of course, Moderna is a venture backed,
right.
I mean, it's a biotech, so it's different than the kind of stuff you talk about mostly, but it is, it is a technology company in a way. So I don't know. I think that stuff's cool.
What a world we live in. All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
The book is The Contrarian. And then, of course, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. Great book, getting fantastic reviews. Hopefully you can get a copy. My guest today has been Max Chafkin. Thanks so much. Talk to you next time.
Take care.